Good evening and welcome. We're going to keep the remarks short because it's very clear you're here hungry to listen to Umberto Eco, and we are thrilled to have him here. I'm Dottie Engler, I'm Director of Public Affairs here, and I also wanted to thank the Harvard Bookstore, who is our partner in this, and recently won what we call the Academy Award for booksellers. They were picked as the #1 bookseller in the United States, both for the quality of the books that they carry, their assistance to customers, and just their overall being great guys in publishing, which is not as frequent as I think we would all like to believe it is. So they deserve applause for that, but we are mostly grateful to them for being our co-sponsors with this event. We both have lists of events that are outside there, but rather than bore you with them, please pick up a flyer on your way out. Umberto Eco was urged by his father to become a lawyer, and he entered the University of Turin to do just that. But instead, he abandoned his law studies and he took up medieval philosophy and literature, writing his thesis on Thomas Aquinas and earning his doctorate of philosophy in 1954 at the age of 22. Some of our doctorate students take 22 years to get through their doctorate, so this is pretty impressive.
The doctor in Italy was not a PhD at that time. It was only 4 years.
He's obviously a modest man and someone who cares a lot about authenticity. So you want to know, what did he do with a degree in philosophy of medieval philosophy and literature? He entered the world of journalism by taking a position in Milan as the editor for cultural programs at Italy's state-owned television network, RAI, which gave him a first-hand opportunity to examine modern culture through the eyes of the media. You can see that it was a very natural transition from medieval philosophy and literature to media and modern culture. In 1956 and 59, he published his first 2 books, which established him as one of the foremost thinkers in medievalism. In 1959, he became the nonfiction senior editor of Casa Editrice Bompiani in Milan and produced a monthly column for Il Veri, a magazine devoted to avant-garde ideas and linguistic experimentation. And many of these columns would later be collected into the book Misreadings. During these years, Eco began seriously developing his ideas on semiotics, and in 1962 he published The Open Work. In 1964 he moved to Milan and took up a position as a lecturer, but a year later he was elected professor of visual communications at Florence. In 1966, he migrated to the Milan Polytechnic as a professor of semiotics and began to organize his theory of semiotics, and in 1968 he published his first text purely on that subject, and it was called The Absent Structure. In 1971, he took up a position as the first professor of semiotics at Europe's oldest university, the University of Bologna, where he flourished and published, and he continues to run its program for communication sciences. Then in 1978 came a slight professional turn, that of a novelist. And in a delightful statement he says, "I began writing in March of 1978, prodded by a seminal idea. I felt like poisoning a monk." The rest, as they say, is history. He produced the remarkable book, The Name of the Rose, which received critical acclaim and popularity outside of the world of academia, and the book sold over 9 million copies. He then began work on his next book, and Foucault's Pendulum was published in 1988, another immediate success. Today he's here to speak about his latest novel, Baudolino, which has been touted as his most lighthearted and comedic work to date, without sacrificing the complexity, texture, and depth of his other novels. Umberto has received honorary doctorate degrees from 23 major universities around the globe, from Brown to the University of Glasgow, to the University of Moscow, to the University of Buenos Aires, and everywhere in between. He's been a visiting professor everywhere, including Yale 3 times. I think that was a little picky of them. NYU twice, Columbia, Northwestern, and several dozen other esteemed institutions. While he has not been a visiting professor here at Harvard, he was selected to be the Norton Lecturer here several years ago, and he is here now. He has received many scientific appointments, literary awards, and decorations, but I suggest if you want to know more about those, as well as to read interesting information that he has to add about the web and how you sort out information and probably every other topic you'd like to think of, go to the web. So without further ado, Umberto Eco.
Good evening. Reading is always useful because I just read the poster and I learned that I was supposed to speak of my last novel, while I was not informed about that point, also because I don't like to speak about my novels. At most I answer questions. But in a way, I am speaking about my last book, which is not Baudolino, which has been published in Italy in the year 2000, but a book that will come out in the next springtime on translation, and mainly based upon my personal experience in interacting with my own translators. And so Baudolino will be dealt with marginally as under the form of an example. And I will deal with a particular aspect of translation on the fact that in order to translate is not only useful to know at least two languages, the original one and the target one, but also to know something about the world, the culture in which the original book was written. Well, I start with an example. In the first chapter of Tolstoy's War and Peace, written, as you know, in Russian, the character, Russian aristocrats, converse frequently in French. French was a foreign language for the Russian reader, as well for readers of all other countries, minus one. And every translation should keep those sentences in French. The intention of the text is to show that for Russian aristocrats at that time it was fashionable to talk in French, even if it was the language of the enemy. The rest of the text makes it clear that the French sentences are only pieces of polite conversation. For instance, Anna Pavlovna remarks that Prince Basil doesn't appreciate and doesn't deserve his own sons, and Basil reacts in French, Lavater aurait dit que je n'ai pas la bosse de la paternité. Anna Pavlovna replies, in Russian, please don't make fun, I want to speak seriously with you. Thus, it is clearly said that what Prince Basil uttered in French was an irrelevant and fatuous quip. However, I think that the reader, in every possible translation, should at least realize that the French sentences are in French. If the same dialogue appeared in a Chinese translation in an obscure Latin alphabet or in Chinese characters, what would readers in Beijing understand? Could they realize that the characters talk in French, the language of their invaders, and could they catch the snobbishness of such a behavior? Probably in a Chinese translation, to render the snobbish aspect of the dialogue, one should render it in English. But in War and Peace, Russians were in war with Napoleon, not with Wellington. But the real problem is how to translate the first chapter of War and Peace in French. One can put the dialogue in French with a footnote saying en français dans le texte. But if one reads the dialogue in a language different from the one of the rest of the novel, one is struck by the sense of something weird. While the same cannot happen with French readers, even though some of them are so patient to read the footnote. Solution. There cannot be a satisfactory French translation of the first chapter of War and Peace. too bad for French readers. The far-fetched case of War and Peace reminds us that a translation can be either source or target-oriented, and I am quoting current currency in the translation studies. Should a translation lead the reader to understand the linguistic and cultural universe of the source text, or transform the original by adapting it to the reader's cultural and linguistic universe? In other words, given a translation from Homer, should the translation transform its readers into Greek readers of the Homeric times, or should it make Homer write as if he were writing today in our language? The question is not preposterous as it seems if we consider that translations age. Shakespeare in English is always the same, but even modern Italian readers read Shakespeare in an Italian translation of the 19th century. We feel uncomfortable. Translators, even when trying to give us the flavor of a language and of an historical period, in fact are modernizing their source. The difference between modernizing a text and keeping it archaic is not the same as the one between foreignizing or domesticating it. Even if there are many translations in which both oppositions are in play, let me consider today the opposition foreignizing versus domesticating. An English translation from a French novel should speak of the left banks or of La Rive Gauche. A mathematician, Thomas Short, made once a funny example concerning the tender French appellation Mon Petit Chou. And the only English translation is My Little Cabbage, which sounds insulting. Short suggests sweetheart, but he admits that in doing so, the translator misses the humorous contrast, the affectionate nuance, and the sound of chou, which reproduces the position of the lips during a kiss, and is strictly phonosymbolically linked to the sound. Chou. Certainly, sweetheart is a good example of domesticating translation. But if the scene takes place in France, I think that one should preserve the French expression. Even in an English translation, one has to say Mon Petit Chou. Maybe the readers do not understand the right meaning of those sounds, but they will probably detect something very French and can guess that French people in love speak so. In American criminal detection novels, frequently the detective asks a driver to bring him downtown or uptown. By a sort of unsigned agreement, all the Italian translators have decided to render it as portami alla città alta, that is to the high or upper city, or portami alla città bassa, that is to the low or lower city. Thus, Italian readers get the impression that every American city is like Budapest or Tbilisi, with a part on the hills beyond the river and a part on the opposite bank. Certainly, to decide how to translate downtown and uptown is a difficult matter, because the sense of the expression changes according to the cities. Normally, uptown is north and downtown is south, but it doesn't mean anything. In certain cities, downtown is the oldest district, in others the business area, in others the red light district. In New York, downtown and uptown are relative concepts. If you are escaping a black gang in Harlem, you ask the driver to run downtown in order to reach at least the plaza. But if you are on the verge of being killed in Chinatown, you ask the driver to run as fast as possible uptown, so to relax at Plaza. The Plaza is neither uptown nor downtown. That doesn't depend on the position of the Plaza, but on yours. Therefore, a good translator should negotiate the translation according to the city. asking the driver to bring him to the business district, to the red light district, or along the river, or else, according to the situation. But these decisions request a vast extra-linguistic knowledge, and translators of detective novels are poorly paid. My suggestion is that one should foreignize and to use downtown and uptown in English to give the tale an exotic connotation, and the reader will understand later when it was wise or not to go downtown at midnight. The double opposition, foreignizing, domesticating, and modernizing and making it archaic, can produce a range of possible combinations. In my novel, The Name of the Rose, there are frequent quotations and book titles in Latin. I had in mind Western readers who were in some way acquainted with Latin expressions, even if they had not studied Latin, and who, reading Pentagonum Salomonis, were able to recognize at least the mention of a pentagon and the name of Solomon. But my Russian translator, Helena Kostyukovich, remarked that those Latin words could sound incomprehensible for a Russian reader, especially if the quotations were transliterated in Cyrillic characters. Moreover, Russians do not associate Latin with religion or monasteries. Thus, Yelena decided to render my Latin quotations in the old ecclesiastic Slavonic used by the Orthodox Church in the Middle Ages, so that the reader could at the same time vaguely understand the text and get the same sense of distance, perceive the same aura of religiosity. Thus, in order to make the translation very archaic, it was necessary to domesticate it. Likewise, Lawrence Venuti, who has written a lot about domesticating and foreignizing, quotes the debate between Matthew Arnold and Francis Newman in the 19th century apropos of Homer's translation. Arnold said that Homer should be rendered in hexameters and in modern English in order to keep the translation in tune with the current academic reception of the Greek texts. Newman, on the contrary, not only constructed an archaic lexicon, but used an old ballad meter so to show that Homer was originally a popular and not an elite poet. Venuti remarks that, ironically, Newman was foreignizing for populistic reasons, and Arnold wanted to domesticate for academic and elitist reasons. Now we come to Baudolino, because I have to do something in order to deserve my salary. That in the first chapter of my Baudolino, I invented a pseudo-medieval North Italian language, written by a quasi-illiterate boy of the 12th century of Piedmontese origins, in an epoch for which we don't have written documents of Italian language, at least for that northwestern area. I didn't have philological purposes, and I was rather inspired by memories of the local dialect I heard in my childhood. In Italy, my text can be understood even by a southerner who smells a sort of northern accent and psychology. Naturally, it can be more appreciated by a northerner who finds there a sort of familiar slang atmosphere. These pages, that fortunately are only 10, posited a lot of problems to my translators. In the same period, there existed Middle English, absolutely incomprehensible for a contemporary English speaker. In any case, Baudolino didn't live in England. To opt for a more modern dialect would have obliged my translator, Bill Weaver, to choose a given Anglo-Saxon area, with risk of making Baudolino to speak, let's say, like Lil Abner. In France, there already were texts in Languedoc and Languedoil, and these two languages, especially for the first one, were rather similar to the northern Italian dialects. Thus, my French translator, Jean-Noël Schifano, had the chance to do his best with a witty patchwork of both obsolete and still popular words and idioms. In Germany, the 12th century is the period of the Minnesänger, but even in this case, that German sounds very abstruse to modern German ears. And Burkhard Kroeber had to invent a balanced mixture of old and modern German. In Spain, the 12th century is the one of El Cantar del Cid, and Helena Lozano found herself in the same situation than Jean-Noël Schifano. In all these cases, and really the translators were bravely fighting in order to realize an acceptable language, it is impossible for any foreign reader to smell any original northern Italian vernacular fragrance. In the hands of my translators, the language of Baudolino became funny, full of linguistic inventions and new coinages, but it was not any longer the language of a young and illiterate Piedmontese boy, and it was impossible to do otherwise. It would be very long to analyze the various bravura pieces devised for every language, and I would rather like to deal with another phenomenon, and the case of profanities and vulgar expressions. There are languages and cultures in which it is customary to name frequently God, the Virgin, and all the saints by associating their name with vulgar expressions. Usually this happens in Catholic countries like Italy and Spain. We are in more intimate terms with the divinity. But there are other languages and culture which are pretty indulgent with curses related to sexual and scatological affairs, and others which are definitely more demure, and in any case extremely thrifty in mentioning our Lord and his saints. Thus, an exclamation that in Italian can sound popular, at most very rude, but not unusual, in German would sound intolerably blasphemous. You probably remember that in Woody Allen's Deconstructing Harry, there is a New York lady who repeats a four-letter word every minute. Well, a German lady wouldn't do so, at least with the same and nonchalant frequency. In the second chapter of my novel, once the vernacular introduction has ended, but popular characters still speak in a popular way, Baudolino enters galloping on his horse the church of Saint Sophia in Constantinople, and to express his indignation for the simoniac behavior of the crusaders who are pillaging the altar clothes and holy vessels, shouts some horrible profanities. The effect, at least in Italian, aims at being a grotesque one, because Baudolino, in order to charge the Crusaders with blasphemy, utters words that our Lord wouldn't approve. But to an Italian reader, Baudolino appears as a scandalized, even though excited good Christian, and not as a follower of the Antichrist. So let's see the first when he enters with his sword, ventre di Dio, Madonna lupa, morte di Dio, schifosi bestemmiatori, maiali simoniaci, e questo è il modo di trattare le cose di nostro Signore? Bill Weaver tried to be as blasphemous as an English speaker can be. Enter God's belly, bite the virgin's death, filthy blasphemers, Simonist pigs. It isn't a way to treat the things of our Lord. Not too bad. But in Italian, Madonna Lupa means to define the Virgin Mary as a she-wolf. It doesn't mean anything, but shows a typical Catholic eagerness to deal more than informally with the holy things. Spanish, Brazilian, French, and Catalan translators had no problem in rendering Baudolino saint indignation. Ventre de Dieu, vierge loup, mordiou, répugnant, sacrilège, porte des simoniaques, c'est la manière de traiter les choses de notre Seigneur. ventre de Dios, virgen loba, muerte de Dios, asquerosos blasfemadores, cerdos simoníacos, esta es la manera de tratar las cosas de nuestro Señor, ventre de Deus, mal de Deus, morte de Deus, nojentos blasfemadores, parece simoníaco este un modo de tratar las cosas de nuestro Señor, etc., etc. The problem is with German. You see, Gottverfluchte Saubande, Lumpenpack, Hurenböcke, Himmelsackreis, das die Art, wie man mit den Dingen unseres Herrn umgeht. Kröbers Baudolino doesn't mention neither God nor the Virgin. He rather insults the Crusaders, saying that they are a herd of pigs condemned by God, a bunch of dirty rats, goats, and sons of a bitch, and the only pseudo-blasphemy Baudolino utters is the only one that a furious German is allowed to utter, Himmelssache, that is heavens and sacrament, which is not so much indeed. Obviously, the comic effect of Baudolino's curses gets lost, since he's not uttering blasphemies in order to charge people with blasphemy. But it would have been impossible to do differently. This is a case in which the translator must accept a definite loss. The problem of curses and four-letter words is a serious one. Once again, Germans are more prudent than Spaniards, and obscenities have a different value and impact in different cultures. Here is an example from the introduction of my novel, this one written in the Baudolino's language. And I apologize if your WASP ears are offended by an expression that in northern Italy is acceptable as an example of popular talk. In this passage, I was describing the way in which the city of Tortona was destroyed by the army of Frederick Barbarossa, and how much the people of Pavia was excited in raising to the ground a city. E poi vedevo i dertonesi che uscivano tutti dalla città, uomini, donne, bambini e vetuli, e si piangevano addosso mentre gli alamani li portavano via come se erano becce, ovvero berbice sull'universa pecore, e quelli di Papia che alle entravano Tortona come matti con fascine, martelli e masse e picconi, che a loro sbattere giù una città dai fondamenti li faceva sborare. To understand at least the situation, here is Weaver translation. And then I saw that the Detonese were all coming out of the city, men, women, and children, and Ulster too. They were crying while the Alamans carried them away like they were beaches, and that burbages and sheep everywhere, and the people of Pavia who cheered and entered Tortona like lunatics with faggots and hammers and clubs and picks, because for them tearing down a city to the foundation was enough to make them come. My text says, faceva sborare. Faceva sborare means, but the popular expression is stronger than the Italian one, that it made them to ejaculate. Weaver's translation is correct, but even an inhabitant of the Bronx would say the same. And probably I wanted something more ethnic. But in any case, okay. You see that Jean-Noël Schifano is making a masterpiece of imaginary old French. I am unable to pronounce it because even a French reader would have a problem. Et puis je vois les Dertenois qui sortent à tout de la cité, hommes, femmes, enfants, et abattre une cité jusque dedans les fondations, le faisoit décharger les quais. It's very good, very expressive. Helena Lozano employs a Latinism, and if you go there, see, los facia ejaculare, which is not Spanish, is Latinism. I tell you, she told me the reason, because the real vulgar expression in Spanish would be coerce. But in first instance, coerce means to run. And in this context in which everybody is moving very fast, the reader could misunderstand the expression by taking it literally. And so there will now be an obscene effect. in order not to lose the sexual connotation, she was obliged to foreignize in this case. Once again, the problem comes with the German translation. It's useless to read everything. Let's consider only the last two lines. Und schrie Ali, Ali, und stürmend nach dort ohne hinein mit Hexen und Hämmern und Keulen und Piken denn eine Stadt dem Erdboden gleich zu machen, das war's ihnen eine große Lust. Eine große Lust certainly evokes a sexual pleasure, but is not as rude and as immediate like the Italian expression, because according to me it can be also the pleasure of having a marvelous meal and so. According to me there was another radical loss, but if Kroeber dared to use a stronger expression, probably his readers would have not been convinced that Baudolino could really speak that way. And so happened. Another problem occurred in translated that chapter of The Name of the Rose with Azzo's dream or vision in the chapter 6-day terse. To create that dream, I was largely used a medieval literary pastiche, the Cena Cipriani, which is a sort of oniric, surrealistic accumulation of images and events from the Bible, from everything, a sort of dreamlike comedy. Except that I put inside it also clips of Azzo's previous experiences, bookish quotations, images coming from the whole repertory of the culture, not only of those times, but also of our time, including disjointed reference to the entire history of art, languages, literature, and so on. As I made a sort of Hieronymus Bosch collage. Among the innumerable quotations, there was the first document of Italian language, the so-called Carta Capuana, Sauco quelle terre per quelle fini, che chi contene 30 anni le possette parte Sancti Benedicti. And it is irrelevant to understand what it means, because it's a very clear allusion for every Italian reader able to remember the first chapter of his or her early handbook of Italian literature. How to translate the quotation in other languages? The Castilian and Catalan versions keep it in its primitive Italian, and obviously no normal Iberian could neither understand nor recognize it. Schifano in French turned the sentence in pseudo old French, sao, avec, exters, and so forth, with the same infelicitous results. He could have chosen a quotation for Le Sermon de Strasbourg, which plays the same role than Carta Capuana in the history of French. But why should Azzo have known this text? Azzo was in the novel a German. Besides, considering that he was German, he could not even know the Carta Capuana. That's true. But I was obviously winking at my readers. So in French, Schifano should have winked at his reader, not to mine. Kroeber, this time in German, had the best chance, because Azzo was German. And he found the text in old German, the last one, that I'm capable to pronounce, and it is irrelevant what he's saying. It was a sort, as Kroeber explained me, of magic spell against some diseases. But it was clearly recognizable by a German reader. And so Kroeber succeeded in introducing in the dream a sort of cultural oniric allusion so that the readers could obscurely perceive that there was a familiar, even though ununderstandable, quotation. Since Hatzell could not know the first document of English language, since it was impossible to leave the Italian quotation, Weaver, with my approval, decided to cut the quotation, and he was reproached by certain extremely subtle critics that analyzed word by word the translation. But he had my approval because, yes, it was legally speaking essential, but not a real loss, since in that dream that lasts for 10 pages, there is such an abundance of ultraviolet and infrared and malicious allusions that one more or one less doesn't make any difference, and the reader can have enough to satisfy its. In my Foucault's Pendulum, the three protagonists, Casaubon, Belbo, and Diotal-Levi, frequently indulge in literary quotations and look as incapable of seeing the world except through their literary recollections. In chapter 57 there is a description of a drive in the hills, and Casaubon reports: man mano che procedevamo l'orizzonte si faceva vasto perché... No, there is something wrong. L'orizzonte si faceva vasto benché a ogni curva aumentassero i picchi su cui si arroccava qualche villaggio, ma tra picco e picco si aprivano orizzonti interminati al di là della siepe, come osservava Diotal-Levi. This text says that the characters go by car through the hills and see beautiful landscapes, so that they have the impression of glimpsing boundless horizons, al di là della siepe, which should be correctly and literally translated as beyond the hedge. Since that hedge is presented as the hedge, the reader could feel embarrassed because no hedge was previously mentioned. However, I was sure that every Italian reader would recognize that hedge, which canonically comes from the intertextual milieu of Italian literature. Di siepe, the hedge, is the one mentioned by Giacomo Leopardi in his poem L'Infinito, perhaps the most famous poem of Italian Romanticism, whose translation, sempre caro mi fu quest'ermocolle, questa siepe, I always loved this solitary hill, this hedge, as well, which takes so large a share of the far-flung horizon from my view, but seated here in contemplation, lost by thought, discovers vaster space beyond supernal silence and unfathomed peace. So, beyond the hedge, there is this sense of infinity. And the Italian reader should understand that Diotal-Levi can enjoy a landscape only through a previous poetical experience. I told my various translators that neither the hedge nor the allusion to Leopardi were important, and I insisted that a literary clue should be kept at all costs. I told them that the presence of a castle or of a tree instead of a hedge made no difference to me, provided that that castle and that tree evoked a famous passage in their own national literature in the context of the description of a magical landscape. You see how different translators solved freely in French, au-dessus de vallées, au-dessus des étangs, au-dessus de vallées. I think it's Lamartine. In German, I don't recognize the quotation. And in Spanish, el sublime espacioso llano. But in Catalan, y tot tenía como un resplendor de eternidad. In English is kids, glimpse endless vista, like Darriere, Diotal-Levi remarked. And that for me, they represent correct, literal translation because they literally reproduce the same effect that the text wanted to produce. In the same vein, please, next one, in chapter 29 of the same novel, in which people is always quoting something, Casaubon, who is in bed with a beautiful girl in Brazil, says, la sera era dolce, ma come avrebbe scritto Belbo nei suoi fais, esausto di letteratura, non spirava un alito di vento. Literally would be, it was a mild evening, but as Belbo, exhausted with literature, might have put in one of his files, there was not even a breath of wind. I reminded my translators that non spirava un alito di vento was a quotation from I Promessi Sposi, the betrothed of Alessandro Manzoni, another text pretty well known to an Italian reader. And that, like in the case of The Hedge, they should have found a recognizable literary quotation in their own language. And so you see the variation. I don't recognize the quotation. There was note but a lovely sighing of the wind. In French, le souffle de la nuit ne flottait pas sur Galgala. I find it beautiful. But the most beautiful one is the German one, because kein Lufthauch regte sich means more or less there was no wind. But Kröber added, über alle Gipfeln war Ruhe, which means on the top of the mountains there was silence, which is a beautiful quotation from Goethe. And it's important the fact that those mountains, which have nothing to do with the fact that the character is making love in Bahia, Brazil, made more recognizable the literariness of the quotation. So in this sense, in this case, I think that the translation improves the original, as it happens usually with my books. So, as you see, to translate means to adapt a text to its target culture without betraying the intention of the author or of the text itself. But there are, in the history of translations, dramatic cases, and I want to end by quoting something less personal and more venerable. My example concerns Averroes' translation of Aristotle Poetics. Averroes, being an Arab, didn't know Greek and hardly the Syriac, and read Aristotle through an Arab translation of the 10th century, which translated at its turn a Syriac version of the Greek original. So he came a third. To increase this mishmash, Averroes' commentary to the Poetics was translated from Arabic into Latin by Hermann the German in 1256. And only later, William of Merbeke translated the Poetics from Greek in 1278. As for Aristotle's rhetoric, in 1256, Hermann the German translated it from an Arab translation, mixing up the Aristotelian text with Arab commentaries. So it's terrible, olea podrida. Only later there was a translatio vetus directly from Greek, and in 1269 another one by William of Merbeke. Okay. Aristotle's text is full of reference to Greek theater, because it's a theory of tragedy, as well as of poetical examples about metaphors that Averroes and his Syriac forerunners had tried to adapt to the literary Arab tradition. Guess how a Latin translator could capture the original sense of Arab versus substituting unknown Greek examples. Jorge Luis Borges, in his short story The Quest of Averroes, shows Averroes while he tries to understand Aristotle's Poetics. He cannot catch the proper meaning of such words as tragedy and comedy because such literary genres were alien to the Arabic culture. The flavor of Borges' story is given by the fact that while Averroes tortures his mind pondering the meaning of these obscure terms, in the courtyard below, some children play. One of them imitates a muezzin, another pretends to be a minaret, and so on. They are performing a theatrical action. But neither they nor Averroes realized it. Later, one of the guests of Averroes tells to have attended in China a strange ceremony. And from the description, the readers, we, but certainly not the characters of the novel, realize that it was a drama. But Averroes doesn't understand it. And at the end of this conversation, he starts again meditating on Aristotle and concludes. Aristotle calls tragedy panegyrics and comedy satires and anathemes. The page of the Quran, as well as the inscriptions of the sanctuary, are rich in tragedies and comedies. The readers are tempted to attribute such an ironic situation to the imagination of Borges. But what Borges narrates is exactly what happened to Averroes. Everything Aristotle refers to tragedy is referred by Averroes to poetry, and mainly to the poetic genres of vituperatio and laudatio. Averroes says that this kind of epidiptic poetry uses representations, but he means verbal representations that can inspire virtuous action. So they are moralizing poems. Obviously, this moralizing idea of poetry doesn't allow Averroes to understand the Aristotelian conception of the cathartic and not didactic function of the tragic action. At a certain moment, Averroes must interpret Poetics 1450, where Aristotle lists the components of a tragedy. Mythos, ethe, lexis, dianoia, opsis, and melopoeia, usually translated as plot, character, diction, reasoning, spectacle, and song. Averroes, and Hermann the German follows him, translate for the first four terms as mythical statement, okay, character, well, meter, okay, belief, and the sixth as melody, but he was certainly thinking of a poetic melody, not of the presence of musicians in the theater. The real drama comes with the fifth component, opsis, which is vision. Averroes couldn't think of staged actions and intends opsis, or whatever is source translated into Arabic, as an argument which demonstrates the moral validity of the represented beliefs. Hermann the German will translate in the same way, but adding, misunderstanding the misunderstandings of Averroes, that eulogy, this virtuous laudatory poetry, doesn't use the art of gesticulation, so excluding the only really theatrical aspect of tragedy. When translating from Greek later, William of Merbeke will properly speak of tragodia and commodia and seems aware of their theatrical nature. It is true that for medieval authors a comedy was a story with a happy end, so that even Dante's poem could be defined as a comedy because it has a happy end, the happiest end of the world. Likewise, in his Poetria Nova, John of Garland defined a tragedy as a poem that starts in happiness and ends in mourning. But in any case, medieval culture knew the place of jesters or histriones and the holy mysteries, and so had an idea of theatre. Thus, William of Merbeke understands that opsis means visus, vision, and it's clear that the vision concerns, and he says so, the mimic action of the hypocrita, or actor. Merbeke gives us a right lexical interpretation because he knew an artistic genre which, in spite of many differences, the medieval culture had in common with the Greek one. One of the real problems of these translations, including the one by Merbeke, was that the Aristotelian texts provided interesting examples of unheard of metaphors, and in some way analyzed them, demonstrating how they were ways of knowing better by identifying new and unexpected similarities between distant events and things. And it is on the basis of those analyses that still today scholars have elaborated theories of cognitive analogies, extending the principle of Aristotelian metaphor even to scientific models. But the medieval translators were unable to understand the Arab metaphors by which Averroes, or his sources, translated the Greek ones, and substitute them with trivial and current examples of well-known rhetorical expressions such as like prata rident, meadows smile, which were so commonly accepted that didn't produce any sensation of a new and exciting discovery. But by disregarding, later Roger Bacon said that the translation of poetics and rhetorics were not accepted by the readers of his time because they were horribly translated. He used says cum squalore, squalidly translated. It was impossible to understand what Aristotle had said. And Merbeke translated very late after the death of Thomas Aquinas, so the text, a more understandable text arrived too late. By disregarding these two texts, the medieval culture remained unable not only to elaborate a theory of the tragic action that flourished only in the Renaissance, but also to elaborate a rigorous theory of metaphor as a cognitive device. Medieval scholars were very, very busy in explaining allegories, particularly in the Holy Scriptures, but were insensitive vis-à-vis the force of metaphors. I mean, poets like Dante invented marvelous metaphors, but were unable to comment on them, to such an extent that when Dante explains the deep sense of his poems, he analyzes allegories, but not only doesn't analyze metaphors, but he uses new metaphors, unexplained, in order to explain allegories. Perhaps this is an extreme example. Personally, I had more chances than Aristotle, not only because I always discussed with my translators, but also because they knew enough of Italian culture to avoid all the traps that drove crazy Aristotle's translators. But honestly, I don't know what happened with my Chinese, Korean, Arab, or Iranian translators. The only thing I know is that the name of the rose that was officially translated into Arabic by a Tunisian publisher got also a pirate edition in the same language, and it appeared under the title Sex in the Monastery. Since the only sexual episode in my novel takes no more than 3 pages upon 500, I really don't know what the hell the translator made. So far for the relationship between culture, language, and the difficult art of translation. Thank you.
Hi. So for the name of the rose, doesn't the title of the book actually reflect that relationship? I'm just wondering if you wanted to actually put a central element to the change that happens to the observant character, because he's the narrator as well. So I'm just wondering what the role was in the book itself.
You mean the title? Well, that it was an unexpected side effect. You know that the original title of the novel was another one. Then I didn't like it. At the end, I put down 10 possible titles. And among them, by mere chance, I put also this one. And all my friends, when looking at the list, they said, this one. And they chose the name of the rose. The name of the rose comes from a Stat Rosa Pristina nomina, comes from a poet of the genre Mais où sont les neiges d'antan? All the great princesses, all the great cities, all the great kings of the world have disappeared, and we keep only their names. That was all. And I found that it was a good title for a book based upon memories of a destroyed library, a destroyed monastery. Then I didn't calculate the amount of quotations of the rose that exist in the world literature. I couldn't avoid the connection with Shakespeare, a rose by any other name, which means exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite. The rose, even with another name, would be always the rose. Why, in my quotation, only the name preserves the memory of something that we don't know. But I had a lot of critical essay on the connection between my title and 15 times that Borges mentioned a rose in his poems. I didn't have it in mind. So this is a sort of proliferation of meanings in different cultures. For instance, in English, it was very difficult to resist the connection with Shakespeare. It's impossible. A Dutch critic showed that there was a very important novel published some decades before in Holland, Van Hoos, and he said that the title had on the public a sort of evocative force, because it reminded that other title of which I was completely unaware. So there are random effects of this kind. I had no intention to produce I said, oh, rose is such a universal symbol that it can work in every culture. And then I put the title in order to mislead the reader, which is one of my favorite sports. Pardon me?
It was good to hear you with your book time. I was hoping to join other things, and it was good to hear you.
Thanks. Thanks, man. In, pardon me?
In Eliot's Middlemarch, I saw one.
That's another story, yeah.
The universal mythology, or the key to the universal mythology. And I was wondering if you felt that your Solon had a softer, more human approach to that search, or was just as less?
That was another story. I called my character Casaubon because Isaac Casaubon, between 16th and 17th century, was the one who demonstrated that the corpus hermeticum was a forgery, a sort of chance forgery. So in a book in which I represent in a grotesque way all the occult culture, Casaubon, I had read Middlemarch in my youth, so I didn't remember anything of Casaubon. But absolutely by a pure chance, I came across the book in my personal library, and I discovered Casaubon. So, oh my God, now somebody would connect my Casaubon. So expressly, in the proofs, I inserted a short dialogue when Belbo and Casaubon meet. I said, "What's your name, Casaubon?" But he says, "There's not some Casaubon in Middlemarch." "Ah, there was also another, but we are not related." Okay. Then an English critic said, but the Eliot's Casaubon wrote A Key to All Mythologies. So you see the connection. Okay. It was an accident. You know, for instance, my Foucault's pendulum is entitled so because it was Léon Foucault who invented that pendulum. If the pendulum was invented by Benjamin Franklin, my book would have been the Franklin pendulum. But I couldn't avoid all the connection with Michel Foucault, which in particular Les Mots et les Choses is dealing with the paradigm of similarity, analogy. I certainly knew, loved this book, but it's not my fault if that man in the 19th century was named Léon Foucault. Happily, he was not called Léon Barthes, otherwise it would be a tragedy. Yes, they are in some way. Those problems are in some way connected with the reception of a book in a given culture. I cannot control if in some of the language it was translated. The word Foucault doesn't mean something horrible. But I make you an example. I had a problem with my Russian translator for the island of the day before because I speak of the orange dove, which really exists and is orange. But she told me the dove in Russian is the same word for blue. How can I represent, she said, a blue-orange? And I don't remember how she solved the situation, but she had a real problem because for me it was important that she was orange because it exists really there, and I couldn't change it. So.
Your last example is exactly where I wanted you to talk some more. You're fortunate enough not only to know your translators, but often you know the language in which the book's being translated. But you write in fiction, you write journalistic kinds of articles, essays, and you also write fairly theoretical works. So my question is, when you're writing these, mostly in Italian, are you thinking and anticipating what problems might occur for translators, or, as you said, what traps might occur for translators? Particularly now, for example.
You mean theoretical works? No, that's different. When writing a theoretical work, maybe not at the beginning of my career, but then early, I knew that they had to be translated, and I was speaking to a universal audience. So I pay attention to the fact that, especially when expressing a given philosophical concept, my syntax should be such as to be translatable in another language. And it happens that most of my theoretical works were previously written in English or in French because there was Congress, and it was also discipline. I remember that once I had a talk at, I don't remember, was it Columbia or at CUNY? I made my talk, and my friend Sam Levin, so, you were of a sort of Kantian simplicity, Kantian. I said, I know why, because not mastering English so well, instead of making long comments, I said, what I want to demonstrate is number one, the number two, number three. After that experience, I decided that if possible, a theoretical work should be first written in another language. So you are obliged to control the fluency of your own language, to chastise your tendency to make metaphors or shortcuts. For the novels, no. Then I work a lot to provide my translators. I give them a dossier of 40 or 50 pages, telling us this should be, could be. I make researches for them. This is a quotation that could be. But if I paid too much attention to the possibility of translation, I would be castrated, so to speak. I could have written the first 10 pages of Baudolino that I decided they were untranslatable. Okay, they were had to be recreated in another way by my translator. So it's a different attitude. For the journalistic activity, when an article of mine is translated for a newspaper, they cut it. They mistranslate it. I know that in any case I will be misunderstood. So. No, I have a comment. To reread myself in a translation sometimes tells me something. Sometimes I must say, well, the translation is better than my original text. Okay, it sounds better. Or the fact that he translated this way throws a new light on my I discovered that my sentence was probably ambiguous, and through the translation it became clear. I don't say the ambiguity was reduced, but the ambiguity was exalted. It happens frequently. But since, as I told you, I work with my translators, I have not the divine surprise that Goethe could have had with Nerval, because I had already long discussions with them. Another interesting experience is when the translator tells you this sentence is ambiguous. Did you want to make it ambiguous or not? And so, no, I didn't. So the fact that it is ambiguous is a syntactic mistake. If I had to rewrite my text, and sometimes in the new edition I change it, I would change it, because I didn't want it to be ambiguous. I was only stupid. In other cases, no, I say no. The tendency of the translator is to disambiguate, and that I know, keep it ambiguous, because it must remain so. There are two persons. after interpreting the text, you decide that if this sentence is used or not. And it's for you to decide how to translate it. But interpretation comes first. The way to decide what is the meaning of the meaning of the text, at which level is relevant. For instance, to decide that the edge would be changed into another thing dependent on an interpretation of the text. A good interpreter should understand that the edge as an edge was not relevant for the text. What was relevant was the attitude of the character who interpreted the major root culture. Only after that interpretation you can decide to change the edge into a valley or a tree or a castle. This is dialect. That was No, there was this young lady first. Paul?
If you don't have a live person such as you would then welcome help that you need to provide to your translators, is there some nuances that cause difficulty to translators? Would you go towards assisting the reader in rendering translator, or being loyal to the intent of the writer?
In my new book of translation, it's okay. My job. I don't pretend to invent the answer in this moment. I frankly say that I have reflected upon it. The basic category is negotiation. Negotiation. You have to negotiate. I made two funny examples, Mon Petit Chou and La Rive Gauche. You can negotiate that in the same text, Mon Petit Chou has to be preserved in French, La Rive Gauche translated as the last bank, according to a certain interpretation we have given of the book. So there is no precise rule. In a certain moment, I tell the translator, go. And in other moments, I say, no, this should be saved. But I don't believe there is a general rule, except, I don't know, you are translating Hesiodus, and you decide that you have to make it archaic, to respect it philologically, and that is the purpose of the collection of the series where the translation appears. But in cases of contemporary works, you have to negotiate. There is a nice example when Hamlet kills Polonius. He draws the sword and shouts, how now, a rat? In English, like in French, in Spanish, in German, there is a difference between a mouse and a rat. In Italian, like in Latin, we have a single word, topo. It's true that we have also topo, who is mouse, basically. We have also ratto, but it is technical. Nobody will use it. So that I discovered that in the Italian translation of La Peste of Camus, the Dr. Rieu finds one morning a sorcio. Sorcio is mouse. Mickey Mouse is a sorcio. And I said, it's impossible it was a sorcio because it's a flag. Then I controlled the original. It was a ha in French. So it was a mistake. But every Italian translation of Hamlet says, che è un topo, never a rat. And I think they're right, for two reasons. First, because I repeat, ratto in Italian is too technical, and there is an homonymy with the adjective ratto, which means spirit, nothing to do. Or maybe, etymologically, a ratto speedy, but I don't know. Second, because in the usual comedy, when a lady jumps over the chair and the gentleman keep a broom, the usual cry is un topo. Never un ratto. So what is relevant in Hamlet? Not that it was a mouse or a rat, but he pretended to be disturbed by an animal and killed the animal, but the problem is that he killed Polonius. And so it's irrelevant whether you believe it was a mouse or a rat. And I think that in this case, the translator can negotiate that the mouse, topo, works pretty well. It gives immediately the impression of an everyday situation, while a ratto wouldn't. But in Camus, is the opposite. That's what I call continuous negotiation. With Shakespeare, you can do that. With Camus, you cannot.
Good time for one last question.
You are asking in which way I can criticize my own work?
Yeah, as a novel.
Yes, I can, but for commercial reasons. No. Really, I don't think a writer can objectively criticize himself. It happens to me a lot of time that in rereading myself, I say, no, I don't like this. Okay. Or, what a genius. I like it very, very much. But, it's linked to the temperature of your body, the quantity of, I don't know what chemical substance in your blood in this moment. You are not honest. Not only you cannot criticize your own, let's say, creative work. After having started to write novels, I am unable to criticize other novelists. I cannot read, if not in certain situations, I am obliged my contemporaries. I prefer to read the 18th century because I don't understand those people who write novels and at the same time they are critics in a magazine, because the sense of competition, either you say, oh, so different from me that it's trash, right? So similar to me that it cannot be but trash, or he's so better than me that I hate it, trash. It's a difficult situation. So if it is such a difficult situation with the novel of my dearest friend, imagine with my own text. So I was not so much joking when saying I can, but I keep silent because I am not reliable. It's different with academic theoretical work because you accept to change your ideas during the time, you accept criticisms, you confront a different position. I would say that on the theoretical level, to criticize himself is a part of the job. Otherwise, you continue to write always the same essay all along your life. But with the so-called creative, it's a sort of incestuous affair that's very difficult. Thank you.